The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 10, Side 1. The administration of dependent territories on the Italian mainland was relatively so just and competent that these districts prospered better under Venetian rule than ever before, and readily returned to Venetian allegiance after being detached from it by the chances of war. Venetian administration of overseas dependencies was not so laudable. They were used chiefly as prizes of war, much of their soil was awarded to Venetian noblemen and generals, and the native population, while retaining their local institutions of government, seldom reached the higher offices. In her relations with other states, Venice was especially well served by her diplomats. Few governments possessed such acute observers and intelligent negotiators as Bernardo Giustiniani. Guided by the informed reports of her ambassadors, the careful statistical records of her bureaucracy, and the astute statesmanship of her senators, Venice repeatedly won in diplomacy what she had lost in war. Morally, this government was no better than others of the time, in penal legislation worse. It made and broke alliances according to fluctuations of advantage, allowing no scruple, no sentiment of fidelity to hamper policy. Such was the code of all Renaissance powers. The citizens readily accepted this code. They approved every Venetian victory, however won. They gloried in the strength and stability of their state, and offered it in its need a patriotism and fullness of service unmatched among their contemporaries. They honored the Doge only next to God. The Doge was usually the agent, quite exceptionally the master of the council and the senate. His splendor far outshone his power. In his public appearances he was clothed in magnificent raiment and was heavy with gems. His official bonnet alone contained jewels to the value of 194,000 ducats, or about $4,850,000. Venetian painters may have learned from his garb the gorgeous colors that flowed from their brushes, and some of their most brilliant portraits are of doges in official robes. Venice believed in ceremony and display, partly to impress ambassadors and visitors, partly to awe the population, partly to give it pageantry in place of power. Even the Dogaressa received a sumptuous coronation. The Doge received foreign dignitaries and signed all important documents of state. His influence was pervasive and continuous through his lifelong tenure amid persons elected for a year. In theory, however, he was merely the servant and spokesman of the government. The long and colorful succession of Doges marches through Venetian history, but only a few impressed their personalities upon the character or fortunes of the state. Despite the dying eloquence of Tommaso Mocenigo, the great council chose the expansionist Francesco Foscari to succeed him. Coming to the throne at the age of 50, the new Doge, in a reign of 34 years, from 1423 to 1457, carried Venice through blood and turmoil to the zenith of her power. Milan was defeated, Bergamo, Brescia, Cremona, Crema were won. But the growing autocracy of the victorious Doge aroused the jealousy of the Ten. They charged him with having won his election by bribery, and, unable to prove this, they accused his son Jacopo of treasonable communication with Milan in 1445. Under the agony of the wheel, Jacopo admitted or pretended his guilt. He was exiled to Romania, but was soon permitted to live near Treviso. In 1450, one of the inquisitors of the Ten was assassinated. Jacopo was credited with the crime. He denied it, even under extreme torture. He was exiled to Crete, where he went mad with loneliness and grief. In 1456 he was brought back to Venice, charged again with secret correspondence with the government of Milan. He admitted it, was tortured to the verge of death, and was returned to Crete, where he died soon afterward. The old Doge, who had borne the perils and responsibilities of a long and unpopular war with stoic fortitude, broke down before these trials, which not all his dignity could prevent. At 86 he became incapable of carrying the burdens of his office. He was deposed by the Great Council with a life annuity of 2,000 ducats. He retired to his home, and there, a few days later, he died of a burst blood vessel as the bells of the Campanile announced the accession of a new Doge. Foscari's victories had earned Venice the hatred of all the Italian states. None could any longer feel secure in the nearness of her grasping power. A dozen combinations were formed against her. Finally, in 1508, Ferrara, Mantua, Julius II, Ferdinand of Spain, Louis XII of France, and the Emperor Maximilian joined in the League of Cambrai to destroy her. Leonardo Loredano, from 1501 to 1521, was Doge in that crisis. He led the people through it with an incredible tenacity only partly revealed in the handsome portrait of him by Giovanni Bellini. Nearly all that Venice had won on the mainland by a century of forceful expansion was taken from her. Venice herself was surrounded. Loredano minted his plate, the aristocracy brought forth its hidden wealth to finance resistance, the armorers forged 100,000 weapons, and every man armed himself to fight for island after island in what seemed to be a hopeless cause. Miraculously, Venice saved herself and recovered part of her mainland realm. But the effort exhausted her finances and her spirit, and when Loredano died, though 57 years of Titian and most of Tintoretto and Veronese were still to come, Venice knew that in wealth and power her zenith and glory had passed. 4. Venetian life. The last decades of the 15th century and the early decades of the 16th were the period of greatest splendor in Venetian life. The profits of a world trade that had made its peace with the Turks and had not yet suffered severe curtailment from the rounding of Africa or the opening of the Atlantic poured into the islands, crowned them with churches, walled the canals with palaces, filled the palaces with precious metals and costly furniture, glorified the women with finery and jewelry, supported a brilliant galaxy of painters, and overflowed in bright festivals of tapestried gondolas, masked liaisons, and babbling waters echoing with song. The life of the lower classes was the normal routine of toil, eased by Italian leisureliness and loquacity, and the inability of the rich to monopolize any but the most perfumed delights of love. Every humpbacked bridge and the Grand Canal teemed with men transporting the products of half the world. There were more slaves here than in other European cities. They were imported chiefly from Islam, not as laborers, but as domestic servants, personal guards, wet nurses, concubines. Doge Pietro Mocenigo, at the age of 70, kept 2 Turkish slaves for his sexual entertainment. One Venetian record tells of a priest who sold a female slave to another priest, who on the following day had the contract annulled because he had found her with child. The upper classes, though so well served, were not idlers. Most of them, in their mature years, were active in commerce, finance, diplomacy, government, or war. The portraits we have of them show men rich in conscious personality, proud of their place, but also serious with a sense of obligation. A minority of them dressed in silks and furs, perhaps to please the artists who painted them. And a set of young bloods, La Compagnia della Scalza, the Company of the Hose, flaunted tight doublets, silk brocades, and striped hose embroidered with gold or silver or inset with gems. But every young patrician sobered his dress when he became a member of the Great Council. Then he was required to wear a toga, for by a robe almost any male may be endowed with dignity and any woman with mystery. Occasionally, in their magnificent palaces or in their villa gardens at Murano or other suburbs, the nobles betrayed their secret wealth to lavishly entertain a visitor or to celebrate some vital event in the history of their city or their family. When Cardinal Grimani, high in both the nobility and the church, gave a reception for Ranuccio Farnese in 1542, he invited 3,000 guests. Most of them came in cabined gondolas smoothed with velvet and eased with cushions, and he provided them with music, acrobats, rope-walking, dancing, and dinner. Normally, however, the Venetian nobility in this period lived, ate, and dressed in moderate style, and earned some fraction of their keep. Perhaps the middle classes were the happiest of all, and joined most light-heartedly in private and public merriment. They provided the lower hierarchy of the church, the bureaucracy of the government, the professions of physician, attorney, and pedagogue, the management of industry and the guilds, the mathematical operations of foreign commerce, the control of local trade. They are neither so harassed as the rich to preserve a fortune, nor so worried as the poor to feed and clothe their young. Like the other classes, they played cards, threw dice, and deployed chessmen across the hours, but they rarely gambled into ruin. They loved to play musical instruments, to sing and dance. As their houses or apartments were small, they made promenades and patios of the streets. These were almost free of horses and vehicles, since transport preferred the canals. So it was not unusual for the less sedate classes, of an evening or on some festal day, to form impromptu dances and choruses in the public squares. Every family had musical instruments and included some bearable voice. And when Adrian Willart led the great double choir in St. Mark's, The thousands who could get in to hear reversed their famous boast and became for a moment Christians first and Venetians afterward. The festivals of Venice, in their unrivaled setting of churches, palaces, and sea, were the most gorgeous in Europe. Every excuse was used for pomp and pageantry: the inauguration of a doge, some religious holy day or national holiday, the visit of a foreign dignitary, the conclusion of a favorable peace, the Garingello or women's holiday, the anniversary of St. Mark, or the patron saint of a guild. In the 14th century, the joust was still the crowning event of a festival. Indeed, as late as 1491, when Venice received with stately ceremony the abdicated Queen of Cyprus, some troops from Crete held a joust on the frozen Grand Canal. But the joust seemed inappropriate to a naval power, and it was gradually replaced with some form of water festival, usually a regatta. The greatest feast of all the year was the Sposalizio del Mare, the solemn and colorful rite of marrying Venice, La Serenissima, the most serene, to the Adriatic. When Beatrice d'Este came to Venice in 1493 as the captivating emissary of Lodovico of Milan, the Grand Canal was adorned throughout its length like some splendid avenue in Christmas time. The ship Bucentaur, symbolizing the Venetian state and all decorated in purple and gold, sailed to meet her. 1,000 boats rowed or sailed around it, each adorned with garlands and bunting. So many were the vessels, said an enthusiastic chronicler, that for a mile around the water could not be seen. In a letter written from Venice on this occasion, Beatrice described a momaria given in her honor in the Palace of the Doges. It was a dramatic spectacle, mostly in pantomime, presented by masked actors called momari, or mummers. The Venetians were fond of divers such performances. They retained till 1462 the medieval mysteries, but popular demand caused these religious plays to be prefaced or interrupted with comic interludes of so loose and disorderly a character that they were forbidden in that year. Meanwhile, the humanist movement renewed Italian acquaintance with classic comedy. Plautus and Terence were staged by the Compagnia della Scalza and other groups. And in 1506, Fra Giovanni Armonio, monk, actor, and musician, presented in Latin in the convent of the Eremitani, Stephanium, the first modern comedy. From these beginnings, Venetian comedy progressed toward Goldoni, always competing with the Harlequin and Pantaloon of the Commedia dell'arte, and at times so rivaling this in uninhibited humor that church and state engaged in a running war with the Venetian stage. An earthy licentiousness and profanity sat side by side in the Venetian or Italian character, with orthodox belief and hebdomadal piety. The populace crowded St. Mark's on Sundays and holy days, and drank homeopathic doses of the religion of terror and hope pictured in the mosaics or sculptured in statue or relief. The deliberate darkness of the pillared cavern intensified the effect of the icons and sermons, and even the prostitutes, hiding for a time the yellow handkerchief which the law required them to display as the badge of their tribe, came here after a weary night to cleanse themselves with prayer. The Venetian Senate favored this popular piety and surrounded the Doge and the state with all the awe of religious ritual. It imported at great cost, after the fall of Constantinople, the relics of Eastern saints, and offered to pay 10,000 ducats for the seamless coat of Christ. And yet that same Senate, which Petrarch likened to an assembly of the gods, repeatedly flouted the authority of the Church, ignored the most terrible papal decrees of excommunication and interdict, offered asylum to prudent skeptics, till 1527, sharply reproved a friar for attacking the Jews in 1512, and sought to make the church in Venice an appanage of the state. Bishops for Venetian sees were chosen by the Senate and were presented to Rome for confirmation. Such appointments were in many cases put into effect despite papal refusal to confirm them. After 1488, none but a Venetian could be appointed to a Venetian episcopate, and no revenues could be collected or used by any ecclesiastic in the Venetian realm who had not been approved by the government. Churches and monasteries were subject to state supervision, but no churchman could hold a public office. All legacies to monastic establishments paid a tax to the state. Ecclesiastical courts were carefully watched to see to it that guilty ecclesiastics should receive the same penalties as guilty laymen. The Republic long resisted the introduction of the Inquisition. When it yielded, it made all verdicts of the Venetian inquisitors subject to review and sanction by a senatorial commission, and only 6 sentences of death were issued in all the history of the Inquisition in Venice. The Republic proudly took the stand that in temporal matters it recognized no superior except the divine majesty. It openly accepted the principle that a general council of the bishops of the Church is above the Pope, and that an appeal may be made from a pope to a future council. When Sixtus IV laid an interdict on the city in 1483, the Council of Ten ordered all clergy to continue their services as usual. When Julius II renewed the interdict as part of his war against Venice, the Ten forbade the publication of the edict in Venetian territory and had their agents in Rome affix to the doors of St. Peter's an appeal from the Pope to a future council in 1509. Julius won that war and forced Venice to accept his spiritual authority as absolute. All in all, Venetian life was more attractive in its setting than in its spirit. The government was competent and showed high courage in adversity, but it was sometimes brutal and always selfish. It never thought of Venice as part of Italy and seemed to care little what tragedy might befall that divided land. It developed powerful personalities, self-reliant, shrewd, acquisitive, valiant, proud. We know 100 of them in their portraits by artists whom they had just enough refinement to patronize. It was a civilization that, compared with the Florentine, lacked subtlety and depth, that compared with the Milanese under Lodovico lacked finesse and grace. But it was the most colorful, sumptuous, and sensually bewitching civilization that history has ever known. 5. Venetian Art. 1. Architecture and Sculpture. Sensuous color is the essence of Venetian art, even of its architecture. Many Venetian churches and mansions, some business buildings, had mosaics or frescoes on their fronts. The facade of St. Mark's gleamed with gilt and almost haphazard ornament. Every decade brought to it new spoils and forms, until the face of the great fane became a bizarre medley of architecture, sculpture, and mosaic, in which decoration drowned structure and the parts forgot the whole. To admire that facade with something fonder than wonder, one must take his stand 576 feet away, at the farther end of the Piazza San Marco. In that perspective, the brilliant conglomeration of Romanesque portals, Gothic ogis, classical columns, Renaissance railing, and Byzantine domes blends into one exotic phantasm, an Aladdin's magic dream. The piazza was not then as ample and majestic as now. In the 15th century it was still unpaved. Part of it was occupied by vines and trees, a stone-cutter's yard, and a latrine. In 1495 it was paved with brick. In 1500, Alessandro Leopardi cast for the 3 flagstaffs such pedestals as no later ones would ever surpass. And in 1512, Bartolomeo Buon the Younger raised the majestic campanile. It fell in 1902, but was rebuilt on the same design. Not so pleasing are the offices of the procurators of St. Mark, the Procuratiae Vecchiae and Nuove, built between 1517 and 1640, and hemming in the piazza on north and south with their immense and monotonous facades. Between St. Mark's and the Grand Canal stood the chief glory of civic Venice, the Palace of the Doges. It underwent in this period so many renovations that little remained of its earlier form. Pietro Basseggio rebuilt, from 1309 to 1340, the southern wing facing the canal. Giovanni Buon and his son Bartolomeo Buon the Elder raised a new wing from 1424 to 1438 on the western or Piazzetta front, and set up the Gothic Porta della Carta from 1438 to 1443 at the northwestern corner. This is called Door of the Paper because on a bulletin board near it the Signory posted its decrees. These southern and western facades, with their graceful Gothic arcades and balconies, are among the happiest products of the Renaissance. To the 14th and 15th centuries belong most of the sculptures on the facades and the superb carvings of the column capitals. Ruskin thought one of these capitals, beneath the figures of Adam and Eve, the finest in Europe. Within the court, Bartolomeo Buon the Younger and Antonio Rizzo built an ornate arch named after Francesco Foscari, and mingling 3 architectural styles in unexpected harmony: Renaissance columns and lintels, Romanesque arches, Gothic pinnacles. In the niches of the arch, Rizzo placed 2 strange statues, Adam protesting his innocence and Eve wondering at the penalties of knowledge. Rizzo planned and Pietro Lombardo completed the eastern facade of the court, a delightful marriage of round and pointed arches with Renaissance cornices and balconies. It was Rizzo again who designed the Scala dei Giganti, or giant's stairs, from the court to the first floor, a simple, stately structure named from the gigantic statues of Mars and Neptune set up by Jacopo Sansovino at the head of the steps to symbolize Venetian mastery of land and sea. In the interior were prison cells, administrative offices, reception rooms, assembly halls for the Great Council, the Senate, and the Ten. Many of these rooms were, or were soon to be, decorated with the proudest murals in the history of art. While the Republic glorified itself in this architectural gem, the richer nobles, Giustiniani, Contarini, Gritti, Barbari, Loredani, Foscari, Vendramini, Grimani, bounded the Grand Canal with their palaces. We must picture these not in their present deterioration, but in their 15th and 16th century heyday, with their facades of white marble, porphyry, or serpentine, their Gothic windows and Renaissance colonnades, their carved portals opening on the water, their hidden courtyards adorned with statuary, fountains, gardens, frescoes, urns, their interiors with tile or marble floors, mighty fireplaces, inlaid furniture, Murano glass, silken canopies, hangings of gold or silver cloth, bronze chandeliers gilded, enameled, or chased, coffered ceilings, and murals by men whose names have gone around the world. So, for example, the Palazzo Foscari was decorated with paintings by Gian Bellini, Titian, Tintoretto, Paris Bordone, Veronese. Perhaps these rooms were more magnificent than comfortable, the chairs too straight-backed, the windows draughty, and no mode of heating that could warm both sides of a room or a man at the same time. Some Venetian palaces cost 200,000 ducats. A law of 1476 tried to limit expenditures to 150 ducats per room, but we hear of rooms whose fixtures and furnishings cost 2,000. Probably the most ornate of the palaces was the Ca' d'Oro, named the House of Gold because the owner, Marino Contarini, ordered that almost every inch of the marble facade should be covered with decoration, much of it in gilt. Its Gothic balconies and tracery still make it the prettiest front on the canal. These millionaires, while feathering their own nests, spared something for the citadels of their incidental faith. Strange to say, St. Mark's was not till 1807 the cathedral of Venice. Formerly it was the private chapel of the Doge and the shrine of the city's patron saint. It belonged, so to speak, to the religion of the state. The episcopal see was attached to the minor church of San Pietro di Castello, in the northeastern corner of the city. In the same remote section, the Dominican friars had their seat in the church of San Giovanni e Paolo. There, Gentile and Giovanni Bellini found their final rest. More important to history is the church of the Franciscans, Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari, built from 1330 to 1443, known in fond abbreviations as I Frari, the Friars. Externally it made no show, but its interior gathered fame through the years as the tomb of celebrated Venetians, Francesco Foscari, Titian, Canova, and as a gallery of art. Here Antonio Rizzo designed a noble monument for the Doge Niccolo Tron. Gian Bellini set up his Frari Madonna, and Titian his Madonna of the Pesaro family. Here, above all, Titian's Assumption of the Virgin rises in majesty behind the altar. Lesser masterpieces adorned lesser fames. San Zaccaria offered its congregation inspiring Madonnas by Giovanni Bellini and Palma Vecchio. Santa Maria dell'Orto had Tintoretto's presentation of the Virgin and his bones. San Sebastiano received Veronese's remains and some of his finest paintings. And for San Salvatore, Titian painted an Annunciation in his 91st year. In the construction and decoration of the churches and palaces of Venice, a remarkable family of architects and sculptors played a persistent part. The Lombardi came to Venice from northwestern Italy, and so earned their cognomen, but their real name was Solari. They included the Cristoforo Solari, who carved the effigies of Lodovico and Beatrice, and his brother Andrea, a painter. Both men worked in Venice as well as Milan. Pietro Lombardo left his mark upon a score of buildings in Venice. He and his sons Antonio and Tullio designed the churches of San Giobbe and Santa Maria dei Miracoli, hardly to our current taste. The tombs of Pietro Mocenigo and Niccolo Marcello in Santi Giovanni e Paolo, of Bishop Zanetti in Treviso Cathedral, and of Dante in Ravenna, and the Palazzo Vendramin Calergi, in which Wagner died, and in most of these enterprises they supplied the sculpture as well as the architectural plans. Pietro himself did much architectural and sculptural work in the Palace of the Doges. Tullio and Antonio, aided by Alessandro Leopardi, set up the tomb of Andrea Vendramin in Santi Giovanni e Paolo, the greatest work of sculpture in Venice, excepting only the Colleoni of Verrocchio and Leopardi in the square before that church. For the adjoining Scuola di San Marco, or Fraternity of St. Mark, Pietro Lombardo designed a rich portal and a strange facade. Finally, a Sante Lombardo shared in building the Scuola di San Rocco, famous for its 56 paintings by Tintoretto. Largely through the work of this family, the Renaissance style of columns, architraves, and decorated pediments prevailed over Gothic ogives and pinnacles and Byzantine domes. In Venice, however, Renaissance architecture, still unsteady with Oriental influence, was too ornate and obscured its lines with ornament. The atmosphere and classic traditions of Rome were needed to give the new style its definitive and harmonious form. 2. The Bellini. Next to St. Mark's and the Ducal Palace, the glory of Venetian art was in painting. Many forces conspired to make the painters the favorites of Venetian patronage. The Church, here as elsewhere, had to tell the Christian story to its people, of whom only a few could read. She needed pictures and statuary to continue the passing effect of speech. So each generation and many churches and monasteries had to have annunciations, nativities, adorations, visitations, presentations, massacres of the innocents, flights into Egypt, transfigurations, Last Suppers, crucifixions, entombments, resurrections, ascensions, assumptions, martyrdoms. When tangible paintings faded or grew stale to a congregation, they might be sold to collectors or museums. They were periodically cleaned and occasionally repainted or retouched. Their authors, if reincarnated, might not recognize them today. This, of course, did not apply to murals, which usually disintegrated on their walls. Sometimes, to avoid this fatality, the picture was painted upon canvas and was then fixed to the wall, as in the hall of the Great Council. In Venice, the state rivaled the church in appetite for murals, for these could feed patriotism and pride by celebrating the grandeur and ceremonies of the government, the triumphs of trade or war. The scuole, too, might order murals and painted banners to commemorate their patron saints or their annual pageantry. Rich men wanted scenes of outdoor beauty or indoor love pictured on the walls of their palaces. They sat for portraits to cheat for a while the ironic brevity of fame. The Signory ordered a portrait of every doge in turn. Even the procurators of St. Mark so preserved their features for a careless posterity. It was in Venice that the portrait and the easel picture achieved most popularity. Until the middle of the 15th century, painting developed slowly in Venice. Then, like some flower catching the morning sun, it burst into unparalleled radiance, as Venetians found in it a vehicle of the color and life that they had learned to love. Perhaps some of that Venetian flair for color had come to the lagoons from the East, with merchants who imported Oriental ideas and tastes as well as goods, who brought back with them memories of gleaming tiles and gilded domes, and displayed in Venetian markets, churches, or homes Oriental silks, satins, velvets, brocades, and cloth of silver or gold. Indeed, Venice never quite made up its mind whether it was an Occidental or an Oriental state. On the Rialto, East and West did meet. Othello and Desdemona could become man and wife. And if Venice and her painters could not learn color from the East, they could get it from the Venetian sky, observing its infinite variety of light and mist, and the splendor of sunsets touching campaniles and palaces, or mirrored in the sea. Meanwhile, the victories of Venetian arms and fleets, and the heroic recovery from threatened ruin, roused the pride and imagination of patrons and painters, and commemorated themselves in art. Wealth discovered that it was meaningless unless it could transform itself into goodness, beauty, or truth. An external stimulus was added to generate a Venetian school of painting. In 1409, Gentile da Fabriano was brought to Venice to decorate the hall of the Great Council, and Antonio Pisano, called Pisanello, came from Verona to collaborate. We cannot say how well they performed, but it is probable that they stirred the Venetian painters to replace with softer contours and richer colors the dark and rigid hieratic forms of the Byzantine tradition and the pale and lifeless forms of the Giottesque school. Perhaps some minor influence came down over the Alps with Giovanni della Magna. who died in 1450. But Giovanni seems to have grown up and learned his art in Murano and Venice. With his brother-in-law, Antonio Vivarini, he painted for the Church of San Zaccaria an altarpiece whose figures begin to have the grace and tenderness that would make the work of the Bellini a revelation to Venice. The greatest influence of all came from Sicily, or Flanders. Antonello da Messina grew up as a businessman and presumably had no thought in his youth that his name would be carried down for centuries in the history of art. While in Naples, he saw, if we accept Vasari's perhaps romantic account, an oil painting that had been sent to King Alfonso by some Florentine merchants in Bruges. From Cimabue, circa 1240 to circa 1302, to Antonello, from 1430 to 1479, Italian painting on wood or canvas had relied on tempera, mixing the colors with a gelatinous substance. Such colors left a rough surface, were maladapted to blending for delicate shades and gradations, and tended to crack and slake off even before the artist's death. Antonello saw the advantages of mixing pigments with oil: readier blending, easier handling and cleaning, brighter finish, greater permanence. He went to Bruges and there studied the oil technique of the Flemish painters, then basking in the heyday of Burgundy. Having occasion to go to Venice, he became so enamored of the city, being himself greatly addicted to women and pleasure, that he spent there the remainder of his life. He abandoned business and gave all his industry to painting. For the Church of San Cassiano, he painted in oil an altarpiece that became a model for 100 similar pictures. The Madonna enthroned between 4 saints, with musician angels at her feet, and full Venetian colors on the brocades and satins of the drapery. Antonello shared his knowledge of the new method with other artists, and the great age of Venetian painting began. Many nobles sat to him for their portraits, and several of these pictures survive. The crude, strong poet at Pavia, the condottiere in the Louvre, the portrait of a man, plump and quizzical, in the Johnson collection in Philadelphia, the portrait of a young man in New York, and the self-portrait in London. At the height of his success, Antonello fell sick, developed pleurisy, and died at the age of 49. The artists of Venice gave him a sumptuous funeral and acknowledged their debt in a generous epitaph. In this ground is buried Antoninus the painter, the highest ornament of Messina and all Sicily, celebrated not only for his pictures, which were distinguished by singular skill and beauty, but because, with high zeal and tireless technique, through mixing colors with oil, he first brought splendor and permanence to Italian painting. Among the pupils of Gentile da Fabriano at Venice was Jacopo Bellini, founder of a brief but major dynasty in Renaissance art. After his tutelage, Jacopo painted in Verona, Ferrara, and Padua. There his daughter married Andrea Mantegna, and through him, as well as more directly, Jacopo came under Squarcione's influence. When he returned to Venice, he brought with him, if we may mingle metaphors, a rubbing of the Paduan technique and an echo of the Florentine. All this, and the Venetian heritage, and later Antonello's tricks with oil, passed down to Jacopo's sons, the rival geniuses Gentile and Giovanni Bellini. Gentile was 23 when the family moved to Padua in 1452. He felt intimately the influence of his brother-in-law Mantegna. When he painted the shutters for the organ in the Padua Cathedral, he followed too carefully the hard figures and bold foreshortenings of the Eremitani frescoes. But in Venice a new gentleness appeared in his portrait of San Lorenzo Giustiniani. In 1474, the Signory assigned to him and his half-brother Giovanni the task of painting or repainting 14 panels in the hall of the Great Council. These canvases were among the earliest Venetian pictures painted in oil. They were destroyed by fire in 1577, but the sketches that remain show that Gentile used for the pictures his characteristic narrative style, in which some major incident is portrayed at the center and a dozen episodes play at the side. Vasari saw the paintings and marveled at their realism, variety, and complexity. When Sultan Mohammed II sent a request to the Signory for a good portrait painter, Gentile was chosen. In Constantinople in 1474 he enlivened the Sultan's chambers and spirits with erotic pictures, and made of him a portrait and a medallion, both showing a powerful character drawn by an expert hand. Mohammed died in 1481. His successor, more orthodox, obeyed the Moslem ban on the painting of human figures, and scattered into oblivion all but those 2 of the works done by Gentile in the Turkish capital. Luckily, Gentile had returned to Venice in 1480, heavy with gifts and decorations from the old Sultan. He rejoined Giovanni in the ducal palace and completed his contract with the signory. It rewarded him with a pension of 200 ducats a year. In his old age, he painted his greatest pictures. The Guild of St. John the Evangelist had what it believed to be a miracle-working relic of the true cross. It solicited Gentile to describe in 3 paintings the healing of an invalid by the relic, a Corpus Christi procession carrying it, and the miraculous finding of the lost fragment. The first panel has yielded its splendor to time. The second, painted when Gentile was 70, is a brilliant panorama of dignitaries, choristers, and candle-bearers parading around the Piazza San Marco, with St. Mark's in the background, appearing very much as it is today. In the third picture, painted at 74, the relic has fallen into the San Lorenzo Canal. The people crowding the bywalks and bridges are panic-stricken, and many kneel in prayer. But Andrea Vendramin plunges into the water, recovers the relic, and then, buoyed up by it, moves with uninfected dignity toward the shore. Every figure in these crowded canvases is drawn with realistic fidelity, and again the artist delights in surrounding the main event with engaging episodes. A boat slipping away from its dock while the gondolier watches the recovery of the relic, a nude black Moor poised to dive into the stream. Gentile's last great picture was painted at the age of 76 for his own confraternity of St. Mark, and showed the apostle preaching in Alexandria. As usual, it is a crowd. Gentile preferred to take humanity wholesale. He died at 78 in 1507, leaving the picture to be finished by his brother John. Giovanni Bellini, or Gian Bellini, or Giambellino, was only 2 years younger than Gentile, but outlived him by 9. In this span of 86 years, he ranged the whole gamut of his art, tried and mastered a rich variety of genres, and brought Venetian painting to its first peak. At Padua, he absorbed Mantegna's technical teaching without imitating his hard and statuesque style. And in Venice, he adopted with unprecedented success the new method of mixing pigments with oil. He was the first Venetian to reveal the glory of color, and at the same time he attained to a grace and accuracy of line, a delicacy of feeling, a depth of interpretation that, even in the lifetime of his brother, made him the greatest and most sought-for painter in Venice. Churches and guilds and private patrons seemed never to tire of his Madonnas. He bequeathed the Virgin in 100 forms to 12 lands. The Venetian Academy alone has a host of them. Madonna with the Sleeping Child, Madonna with 2 Holy Women, Madonna con Bambino, Madonna degli Alberetti, Madonna with St. Paul and St. George, Madonna enthroned, and, best of this group, the Madonna of St. Job. This, we are told, is the first picture that Giovanni painted in oils, and it is one of the most brilliantly colored works in Venice, which is to say, in the world. The little Museo Correr at the western end of the Piazza San Marco has another Giambellino Madonna, tender and sad and lovely. San Zaccaria has a variation on the Madonna of St. Job. The Church of the Frari has a Madonna enthroned, a little stiff and severe and hemmed in by gloomy saints, but appealing in her rich blue robes. The zealous wanderer will find many more of John's Virgins in Verona, Bergamo, Milan, Rome, Paris, London, New York, Washington. What more in color could be said of Our Lady after this polygraphic devotion? Perugino and Raphael would rival this multiplicity, and Titian in that same Church of the Frari would find something more to say. Giovanni did not do so well with the sun. Christ's blessing in the Louvre is middling, but the sacred conversation near it is movingly beautiful. The famous Pietà in the Brera at Milan has been warmly praised, but it shows a duet of charmless faces holding up a dead Christ who seems to need nothing more for perfect physical condition than to be freed from too much attention. This harsh and crude burial picture, undated, belongs to Bellini's Montaigne-esque youth. How much more pleasing is the Santa Giustina in a private collection in Milan, again somewhat stylized and posed, but with a delicacy of features, a modest drooping of the eyelids, a splendor of costume that makes this one of John's most successful efforts. It was apparently a portrait, and John was now so skilled in rendering a living face and soul that 100 patrons begged to share his immortality. Look again at Doge Loredano. With what depth of understanding and keenness of eye and dexterity of hand, Bellini has caught the unfaltering, serene power of the man who could lead his people to victory in a war for survival against the united assault of nearly all the great states of Italy and Transalpine Europe. And then, rivaling the Leonardo who was creeping up on him in skill and fame, Giovanni tried his palette at bizarre landscapes, like that medley of rocks, mountains, castles, sheep, water, riven tree, and clouded sky, which St. Francis in the Frick collection calmly confronts as he receives the stigmata. In his old age, the master tired of repeating the usual sacred themes and experimented with allegory and classic mythology. He turned knowledge, happiness, truth, slander, purgatory, the church herself, into persons or stories, and sought to bring them to life with alluring landscapes. 2 of his pagan pictures hang in the Washington National Gallery: Orpheus charming the beasts, and the Feast of the Gods, a picnic of bare-breasted women and half-naked, half-drunken men. The picture is dated 1514. It was painted for Duke Alfonso of Ferrara when the artist was 84 years old. We are reminded again of Alfieri's boast, that the man-plant grows more vigorously in Italy than elsewhere on the earth. Giovanni lived only a year after signing that testament of youth. His was a full and reasonably happy life, an astonishing procession of masterpieces, a kaleidoscope of warm colors on soft robes, an immense advance in grace, composition, and vitality upon the Giotteschi and the Byzantophiles, a power of perception and individualization unseen in the arid figures and indiscriminate masses of Gentile's pictures, a fruitful mediation in time and style between a Mantegna who knew only Romans and a Titian who felt and pictured every phase of life, from Flora to Charles V. One of John's pupils was Giorgione, who developed his master's idols of wood and stream. Titian worked with Giorgione and received the great tradition. Generation by generation, Venetian art was accumulating its knowledge, varying its experiments, and preparing its culmination. 3. From the Bellini to Giorgione. The success of the Bellini made painting popular in Venice, where mosaics had held so long a sway. Studios multiplied, patrons opened their purses, and artists developed who, though they were not Bellini or Giorgione's, would have been the brightest stars in lesser galaxies. Vincenzo Catena painted so well that many of his pictures were credited to John Bellini or to Giorgione. Antonio Vivarini's younger brother, Bartolomeo, met a conservative demand by applying to medieval themes the technique of squarcione and the fuller colors that painting had learned to mix and convey. Bartolomeo's nephew and pupil, Alvise Vivarini, threatened for a time to rival Gian Bellini with pretty Madonnas, and achieved a monumental altarpiece, Madonna with 6 Saints, which passed from Italy to the Kaiser Friedrich Museum in Berlin. Alvise was a good teacher, for 3 of his pupils found moderate fame. Bartolomeo Montagna we leave to Vicenza. Giovanni Battista Cima da Conegliano worked for the Madonna market. One at Parma has a handsome figure of the Archangel Michael, while another in Cleveland redeems itself with brilliant color. Marco Bazzaiti painted a fine Calling of the Sons of Zebedee in Venice, and a delightful portrait, a youth, in the London National Gallery. Carlo Crivelli may also have been a pupil of the Vivarini. However, he had to abscond from Venice soon after his 17th year. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.